All right, I am immigration and citizenship attorney Parviz Malakouti, and this is our 10th mobility spaces on X. And today we're talking about nationalities in wartime: USA, Iran, Israel, Russia, Ukraine, etc. Not sure if you've heard, but there seems to be a little dust up in the Middle East current, or at least one of them. Iran and Israel are currently at war with one another. It's a restrained war, but they're at war as of last week. I believe it was June 12th, and things happen to people's citizenships when their countries are at war. We've seen time and time there are patterns that emerge in the way countries react to their own citizens, how countries react to citizens of other countries that are at war, and then also how other people actually react to people who are citizens of countries that are at war, both formally and informally. And that those patterns are what I'd like to talk about today. And just to clarify, this is not really a political discussion. We're not talking about who's at fault, who's in the right, who's in the wrong. We're talking about how nationalities of people are affected by wartime. And also, we're not talking necessarily about what it's like to be in a country that's at war, right? Obviously, if you're in the country, you're probably in physical danger. You might be bombed or blown up. There's a whole lot of things that happen. But I'm more focused in this conversation with what happens to people's nationalities, citizenships, what effects are there? And I have a list, just a starting list of a few patterns, things that come up that I'd like to talk about. And we're not, of course, restrained to this, but here are a few effects. One is military conscription, right? So some countries, of course, have mandatory military service, whether in wartime or not, right? And some countries only conscript when they're in wartime, right? So obviously, if you're a citizen of a country that has mandatory military conscription, um, or basically calls up military age men to war. That's something to consider. That's a factor that you have to plan for. The second is consular assistance, right? Now, consular assistance can be a double-edged sword, right? In one way, if you're at war, or if you're a citizen of a country at war, if you're living in a country that's at war, your country might offer consular assistance to you in the form of an evacuation ship or flight, things like that. There's just a few articles a few days ago of the United States basically offering evacuation. I believe it was ships in Israel to American citizens in Israel. I consider that to be on the positive side of consular assistance, potentially a positive effect, right? A country of your citizenship giving you a path to get out of the danger zone, off the X. But there's also a negative side as well, okay, which is withholding of documents and consular services. And so what we've seen happen, I posted an article from 2024, most recently, of Ukraine basically withholding consular services to their military-aged men, and I believe they define that as age 18 to 60, abroad. So basically, basically withholding their ability to obtain vital documents, to renew their passports, to get other consular services, and that's obviously in part of an effort to pressure those Ukrainian citizens abroad to return home and be subject to the Ukrainian government and possibly be, pressed into service. So that's consular assistance. Third one is constriction of third country visa issuance, and this is an effect on citizenships during wartime that I think is really under discussed. A lot of people are not aware of this, and this is a simple concept that if you are a citizen of a country that's at war, other countries that typically, when you're not in wartime, may have issued you a visa or a residency, whether it be temporary or permanent, are going to, generally speaking, be less willing to do so, right? Because third party countries don't want an immigration or humanitarian crisis on their hands, right? I think other countries presume, justifiably so, that if you are a citizen of a country that's currently at war, that you're more likely to return to desperate measures in order to escape that war, including overstaying a visa, right? So those options tend to constrict, and by those options, I'm talking about third country visa issuance. Fourth one, closing of third country consulates in country. So this is an obvious one. If you're a citizen of a country that's at war, other countries that have consulates in that country are more likely to close their consulates, to shutter their consulates, which means they're not going to be giving services, right? Because they obviously want to look out for their consular staff. They don't want them in harm's way. If the consulate is shuttered, you may not be able to apply for and be issued a visa or residency at that consulate in your home country. Fifth one is travel bans, right? So, countries, third country observers sometimes take sides when two or three countries go to war. And sometimes part of taking sides means issuing a travel ban on citizens of the country that's on the other side, right? So this is nothing new. This is part of the visa issuance playbook, so to speak, that we've seen for at least 100 years. Sixth item on this list: heightened security standards, right? So both domestically and abroad, countries that are at war tend to kind of, tighten up their security standards, including possibly tightening up censorship standards, right? So we're seeing that happen in Israel right now from reports that are coming out, and then of course that's already been the case in Iran. Iran already exercises pretty robust censorship on citizens and others that are in the country. And then the seventh item that's on my mind here that I'd like to talk about is legislation from one country targeting perceived citizens of the enemy country that are within their borders. So, country goes to war, right? For example, United States against Japan, Germany, Italy during World War II. And then people that are not just Japanese citizens, but even just people that are of Japanese ancestry, or sometimes even people who look Japanese, right, get caught up and they get put into internment camps. They get other types of restrictions on their freedom and liberty. This is something to consider. That's definitely an attack vector, right? Now, at the time during World War II, dual citizenship was a much less frequent phenomenon than it is today. But nowadays, we have tons and tons of dual citizens all over the world, all different types of combinations of dual citizens. So generally, the likelihood, the chance that you are in one country and citizen of one country that's gone to war with your other country of citizenship goes up, right? So right now, if you are, if you're in Iran and you're an Israeli citizen, and there are Israeli Iranian citizens, I know some, you're obviously, straddling, you're citizen of two countries that are at war. If you're in the United States and you're an Iranian citizen, and if, America, kind of openly, states that they're at war with Iran. And of course, there's speculation now that United States already has their hand in it. But if they formally basically acknowledge it, then, obviously as a dual citizen, you'll be citizen of two countries that are at war. So these are just a few of the patterns, the big patterns that come up affecting citizenships and nationalities when people are at war. So I'd like to open this up and discuss. So far, we have Patrick here. We have inverted fragility. I'm going to invite you to speak if you'd like to chime in at any moment. So, first question is for Patrick. General one, Patrick. When you think about nationalities in wartime, what pattern or effect comes to your mind first?
Thanks for this is a very timely spaces, so thank you for hosting this. Yeah, so I would start by saying when conflict arises, there's usually a little bit of a lead up to it, but by definition, the worst conflicts usually are a surprise, definitionally, right? Uh, the sinking of the Lusitania was a surprise to Americans. So was Pearl Harbor before World War II, 9/11. There's the list of examples goes on and on. And so usually there's an immediate reaction, right? And so that immediate policy reaction generally is the tactical, and that is the closing of consular operations. And the paradigm I'd like to offer in this perspective is that don't think of consulates just as a means for a country to take care of their citizens abroad. That is true. But also within the government, consular services or consular staff are an interest group for the government back home, right? Um, even in the American context, we think of ambassadors as someone who might like write a big campaign check, but for most of the world, they're career diplomats, they're career consular officers, and they don't really have a big say when it comes to advocating for themselves in government because they're seen as a service. But when suddenly there is something that is a conflict or something that is overtaxing, the government will look out for them because they're such a lifeline to citizens abroad that the home government doesn't really want to make sure that they are not functioning or not working, right. And the top of that list is conflict. And so um you know it doesn't always have to be a hot war like the case is appearing today between Israel and Iran, but look at the conflict with Ukraine and Russia. you know to what extent are consular services offered by the United States or any EU country if you are in Moscow? If you're not in Moscow, so if you're in a city that doesn't have the embassy but just a consulate, there's a good chance that that consulate is closed. Um, and that is true, not just in hot wars, not just in cold wars, but also in diplomatic spats. If you're a Venezuelan working in Guyana, you probably don't have access to your consular services um, because of that border dispute. I would also argue that if you're looking at something like, of course, something epidemiological like a pandemic can shut consular services. But in conflict, um, those conflicts can definitely kind of leave you stranded. A very esoteric example would be, for those who don't remember, when in Venezuela, Maduro was no longer formally recognized by the United States and most of the Western Hemisphere, and they recognize someone else as the president. Well, all of that consular staff out there still reports to the functional government and might not report to what is otherwise internationally recognized as a leader. And so your ability to access those consular services, even though it's essentially sort of a Cold War situation or a cold diplomacy situation, your ability to access those consular services is diminished. So I'll stop there, but the way I would look at it in gradiating effects. The first one is what happens within the first 48 hours. And generally, that's going to be consular services. And even if then you're stuck and you have to call back home to, say, the embassy back at home, that's going to be a very, very busy phone line. And your ability to operate with your specific needs or requirements in country is going to be really challenging to be met. So I'll leave it there, but that's my first thoughts.
Yeah, just to echo one of your points. So, during that time that the United States recognized an opposition leader in Venezuela as the leader, there were no consular services available to Venezuelan citizens in the United States. And of course, this is not even war that we're talking about. This is just basically, frosty relations, bad relations. And I had a couple clients at the time actually who needed a renewal of their Venezuelan passports. One of those clients was without immigration status in the United States. So if she were to leave the United States in order to try to go to a consulate, a Venezuelan consulate abroad, she would not be allowed to come back into the United States. And that was a real issue for us, trying to figure out a way. At the time, basically, what we were trying to do is see if we could get her some sort of parole to Mexico, which we had identified as the closest, most accessible consulate for her, and one that she could travel to overland to Mexico. So that was a huge issue for her. That was a person who was a single citizen, right? Venezuelan citizen, located in the United States and without status, without immigration status in the United States. Consulates are lifelines for people. They're kind of like lifeline networks for people that are citizens of those countries abroad. It's their ability to, they're critical oftentimes to their ability to get documents that they need in order to move around, to live their life. The first one, obviously, that comes to mind is a passport. So it's a huge issue. Okay, so we got inverted here. We got David. Thanks for joining. We got Patience as Alpha here as well, right? So, okay, so I'll just continue on actually with going a little bit deeper into some of these patterns that I mentioned. First one is military service, right? So, military service is one of my four red flags of second citizenship, mandatory military service, right? And what I've written in my article for four red flags, and what I say to people is that if a country has mandatory military service, it's not automatically a don't get the citizenship. It's not automatically a no-go. It's a proceed with caution. It's an investigate. It's a consider, right? Interestingly enough, we right now the two countries that are at war. Well, obviously Ukraine and Russia are at war as well now, but both Israel and Iran have mandatory military service for military-age men. Israel, of course, also has it for females as well. So that's a consideration, right? That's a huge issue, right? If you're a citizen of one of those countries, right, and you have not, or you're considering becoming a citizen and you have not served in the military, your reliance on one of a few things to make sure that you don't get caught up, basically against your will in the military, right? One is the possibility of getting some sort of exemption or exception, right? Iran and a lot of other countries, Armenia had this as well, has the ability to basically sometimes, some years, in some legislative years, to purchase the military service obligation. The idea is basically you pay off the obligation. Instead of going, you pay a certain amount of money. It's usually in the single digit thousands or so to basically alleviate yourself of that obligation, right? That's one way. Second thing is some countries have a delay or exception mechanism for their citizens that are resident abroad, right? So if you're a citizen of a country that has mandatory military service, sometimes those countries will, and obviously it's country by country, sometimes they'll allow you to delay indefinitely the military service if you're resident abroad, if you're never actually resident in that country. And then the third way of avoiding it is just the crudest way, okay, which is if you have no other options, just don't go to the country, or don't go to places that I guess if you're on the radar enough, don't go to places that could possibly snatch you up, that are close enough and influenced enough by that country to possibly snatch you up and press you into service. So those are kind of the first three things that come to mind here. And then I'm sorry, the first three aspects of military service, mandatory military service, being implicated, that come to my mind. And then the consular assistance piece is probably the second one that comes to my mind as well. Especially if you only have one citizenship. If you have one citizenship and you're resident abroad, you're vulnerable to a shutdown or a slowdown in consular services. From that country. For the reasons that Patrick mentioned and I also mentioned. So anyway, what do you guys think? Do we have any? You don't have to talk specifics, but do we have any people in the space that have been citizens or are citizens of countries that have been at war recently? You don't have to mention the country, but have you been affected by? Has your nationality been affected by your country being at war?
I can't say that I've ever been in a situation where my country has been directly impacted because of war from a citizenship or consular service perspective. And I'm jumping in here only because no one else jumped in. So if someone else has a direct experience, please cut me off. I was just going to add to what you said before, with essentially saying it's worthwhile to do a little back of the napkin math and political analysis when you're looking at a citizenship for a country. Um, because if there is a conscription that's mandatory conscription and stays in place, like with Iran, like with Israel, that's at least a known service requirement. But there are situations like Ukraine where if suddenly conflict arises, that draft can be that conscription can be instituted, and whether or not a draft can be instituted or not is an open question, right? And so I think it's worthwhile to look at some of these citizenships and do a soft analysis to be able to predict that. Ukraine does not allow formally dual citizenship. It has demographic issues, and it's up against a foe that is superior in numbers. All of that says that they would institute a service requirement. Um, and I could have told you that 10 years ago or 5 years ago, right? And so I think it's worth it to kind of look at your portfolio of citizenships and say, if something happens, what are my, what is the strategy? If I want to avoid conscription, what's the strategy, right? And I'll also add that, unlike I'm unfamiliar with the ages for Iran's conscription or mandatory service. Um, that's also true with Israel. I believe it's a wider range one might think, but I think it's up to 30. But I know in Ukraine it's up to 60. And that people may look at that and see that as a little bit old-fashioned, but I would go out on a limb and say that in the American experience in conflict during World War II, all men aged up to 60 had to register for the draft. They were not called. Older people were not called to serve, but they did have to register. And if you have an American ancestor who was around in that time, it is today called the Old Man Draft Registration Card. For anyone between the ages of 40 to 60, they were still required to register for the draft. Doing that a little analysis helps not just understand the present, but the potential for the future.
Yeah, thanks for that, Patrick. So last I checked with Iran, from the age of 14 or 15, you're not expected to serve, but that's when restrictions on your mobility start being imposed in the form of either non-issuance of passport or basically inability to leave the country. As far as aging out of mandatory military service, I'm not sure, but I believe you start aging out currently when you're in your 40s, assuming you haven't either served. And the service, I believe the standard period is 2 years of service, or a slightly shortened period of time if you go to kind of like a less desirable post. But I believe if you haven't served or fallen into some sort of exception, I believe you start aging out in your 40s currently. But as you stated, if and when countries get drawn into bloody long wars, they drop their standards, right? They drop their standards and they increase their age requirement, right? 40-year-olds, 50-year-olds, sometimes even 60-year-olds. I want to talk about country springboard, basically third country springboarding, and specifically consular shopping, right? I call it either the friendlier consulate springboard or consular shopping, right? It's this idea of being able to access a foreign country's consulate in other countries other than your own, right? And this is obviously a solution. This is kind of a strategy, I guess, for inability to basically have the services of a particular consulate in your country, right? And typically there's kind of like two bottlenecks I find for trying to basically consular shop. And what I mean by that is, let's say, for example, hypothetically, you're I don't know, let's call it you're an American citizen. Let's say you want to do something with the Venezuelan consulate. Let's say you want to apply for a Venezuelan visa, okay? And let's say the Venezuelan consulate is shut down in your country, or let's say they have limited services, or let's say there is none. There is no consulate, right? Some countries don't have a consulate in a foreign country. In order to basically access those services, you're going to have to visit a Venezuelan consulate in another country, right? Two big bottleneck points for that. Okay, one is you have to have the ability to travel to that other country in order to access Venezuela's consulate in there. If you have, citizenship in a country that has strong visa-free access, that'll be less of a problem for you. But if you have a citizenship that has poor visa-free access, that could be a problem. You might have to apply for a visa even just to get to that third country. Let's call it Mexico, right? Of course, the United States, Americans don't need a visa to go to Mexico, but let's say hypothetically, in order to access the Venezuelan consulate in Mexico. So that's the first bottleneck, right? The ability to physically go to that third country to access the other country's consulate. The second bottleneck, and I think this one, fewer people are aware of this, is that not every consulate will serve everybody, right? Some countries' consulates have guidelines on who they're willing to serve. Okay. And obviously each country can and does make its own rules and its boundaries of the rules. But common boundaries are that consulates will only serve a person that's resident in their district, okay, in that country, okay, so meaning, or citizen of that country. So for example, let's say the Venezuelan consulate in Mexico, Mexico City, and I don't know if this is the case, I'm just saying hypothetically, right? That consulate might only serve, okay, Mexican citizens or people that are resident in Mexico, right? So if you're a multiple citizen, right, obviously that's an additional little benefit. That's an additional springboard benefit that you get, right? If you're a citizen in 3 or 4 countries, you can obviously easily make the claim that you're resident there, right? Typically, citizens don't also need a resident permit, okay? And you have less difficulty basically accessing more consulates in more countries for whatever need it is that you have, okay? So that this the consular shopping slash friendlier consulate springboard, it's something that I find is still pretty little known among the general public as a strategy, but it's becoming more visible. More people are kind of understanding this tactic and the strategy, and even more immigration and mobility professionals are using this. So, obviously, if you are a citizen of a country that's at war, Ukraine or Russia or Iran or Israel, right? You're going to be served in being able to navigate the conflict, avoid it physically if you want to, and avoid the fallout from it if you are a citizen also in a country that's not at war. Now, downsides, right? Obviously, there's potential downsides to being citizen in multiple countries, and Alex Ugorji kind of referenced this, mentioned this in one of our previous spaces. I agree with him entirely, and that's the fact of multiplying your obligations. And also, I would add to that the fact of multiplying the chances that you're citizen of a country that's at war, right? If you're a citizen of just one country for your entire life, you might live your whole life without ever actually, your country ever being at war. If you're a citizen of 2 countries, that increases the chances that you're a citizen of a country that's at war. 3 citizenships increases the chances even more. But if you're a citizen of some countries, I mean, if you're a citizen of the United States, you might always be at war, right? You're, with somebody. But obviously, there are countries that are much less you know, volatile, much less aggressive on foreign policy, much less imperial, or however it is that you want to say it, and those citizens, they may never in their lifetime actually experience war, right? But if you ramp up, to 3 citizenships or more, chances are pretty good that at some point in your life, if not multiple points in your life, you're gonna be a citizen of a country that's at war. So that's a consideration. That's a potential downside, especially if that the country, the citizenship that you're thinking about picking up, whether it be by naturalization or by making a claim that you're already a citizen by operation of law, sending in the paperwork. If it's in a country that's in a volatile area of the world, or a country that's oftentimes at war, okay, I'd say Israel is oftentimes at war. Iran is not oftentimes at war, but is in a volatile situation, and obviously at odds with important countries. So these are, the potential wartime downside to citizenship is a serious consideration for people that have a claim to those citizenships. And typically, if you're an American listening to this, typically I find that it's not that you have access to those citizenships by naturalization. It's less frequently by naturalization, because that usually comes about as a result of living in the country for several years. But it's more so because you have a parent or a grandparent or a great grandparent even that was citizen of that country, which allows you to make a claim. So it's Americans that are entitled to citizenship by descent in Middle Eastern countries, other third world countries, African countries that are either commonly at war or at risk of being at war. It's this scenario that most often presents itself when an American is trying to figure out whether they should, go through the analysis to see if they qualify for the citizenship, or if they're already technically a citizenship by law, and then of course apply. All right, we got Patience here. I know Patience is shy sometimes, but I know he's got plenty to say. We got David here. We got Inverted here. So let me put out a question here to the group. Anybody who wants to take it, go for it. Heightened security standards. Okay, the idea, not the idea, but basically the pattern of countries going to war, imposing heightened security standards, not just on everybody that's within the country, but sometimes even on their own citizens that are abroad. How much of a consideration should that be for a person in considering whether to apply for a citizenship in a country that is either often at war or often at high risk of being at war. Heightened security standards. Is that really a red flag, or is that something that can be navigated fairly easily? We got Jay here too as well. Welcome, Jay. Feel free to chime in if you'd like.
I'll just say a couple thoughts. For me, initially, it would come down to, like, is this, what are the odds of the country that I really want to be living in? What are the odds that they are going to go to war? What are the odds that another country that I'm not really planning on living in, or not currently planning on living in, or it would be hard to see myself living in? Okay, they have some sort of, let's say, conscription requirements. What are the penalties for not fulfilling those requirements? Like, do they have the power to ruin my life? Et cetera, et cetera. And then beyond that, it would depend on, honestly, for me, like, I don't currently have any children, but if something I think about, or my brother, you know, is this something that I would want? Is this a potential burden that you would necessarily want to pass on to your children? And then the same question there. Okay, what's the penalty for them not to participate, etc.?
Yeah, exactly. There's a multi-generational knock-on effect, right, for both benefits and potential attack vectors. Yeah, absolutely. Both have to be considered, right? There's so many factors to consider about, whether to get a citizenship or not. I think it makes your head spin. You have to bring order to this. You have to bring hierarchy to the considerations, right, in order to make any sense of it, right? That's why I inverted my framework. The way I think about things is the first level of division, categorization that I'm going to make is what are the drawbacks that affect you, that follow you wherever you are in the world, and what are the drawbacks that affect you primarily or only when you're in the country, and therefore you can escape or leave by physically leaving the country. And that's where I come up with basically the idea of extraterritorial effect of the obligation, kind of being the first, categorization of potential downsides. Okay, in terms of how to order these things. Obviously, you got to order them even more after that, right? That's just the first categorization, right? But obviously, I'll discount a potential downside if it's something that can be escaped by just leaving, by leaving. Poor economic situation, strict social laws, strong regulation or onerous regulation on business or personal dealings, right? You get away from those by just leaving the country, right? So if you have great other benefits that you can observe from having that citizenship, another passport, strong visa-free access from the country, maybe multilateral or bilateral treaties that give you strong springboarding opportunities in foreign countries. Well, it might not be that big of a deal, right? If the country has, let's call it, less than ideal obligations or downsides that act only territorially. So that's the big division or the big categorization that I make first, right? Especially when you're thinking about what's going to pass on to your other children. This comes up in the context of CBT, right? Citizenship-based taxation right now. This is a hot topic right now, generally, and of course, definitely among the people that are in this space right now. Most people that are here are aware of this issue. And for multiple citizens that are Americans, also American citizens, or legal permanent residents in the United States, right? At the top of their mind, if they're aware of the issue, is whether I want to try to pass this thing on, citizenship, to my children, especially if you are living abroad, if you're primarily not in the United States. As far as wartime is concerned, first thing I'm thinking about is mandatory military conscription, right? And then also the possibility of being targeted so if you are unlucky enough to be citizen in both the countries that are at war with one another, then basically whether and to what extent you're at risk of being targeted, being resident in one country because you're citizen of quote unquote the enemy country. These are the top two things that come to my mind when I think about practical considerations of war on nationality. Okay, let's get into a little bit more about what I call nationality toggling. Okay, what I call nationality toggling is basically just the idea that if you're citizen of multiple countries and you are traveling in third countries, so you're citizen of Iran and the United States, for example. You're traveling in France or Hungary or Algeria, okay? You have two national identities, right? You make decisions typically about how you present yourself, okay, and under what umbrella, under what identity you present yourself when you're in that third country. This is why I call it toggling, right? And there's benefits to this. There can be strong benefits to this, obviously, especially if one of your countries is at war, right? If one of your countries is at war or unpopular or targeted for some reason, and then you go to a part of the world that's antagonistic to that country, right? You can toggle to another citizenship, right, and just avoid, just sidestep, okay, some of the problems that could come up, okay, whether it be in terms of how you're actually treated based off of the passport that you present when you're at the border, all the way to basically how you're treated just by regular people or service providers, hotel operators, taxi, whatever. When they find out or ask what country you're a citizen of. This is obviously a huge benefit of multiple citizenship, and definitely one that's I still think it's underrated. More and more people kind of vaguely, I feel, understand the idea that when you're a citizen of two countries, you can kind of present yourself in different ways. But people aren't exactly sure of in what way can you do that, right? The other thing that's kind of cool or interesting is that if you go when you're traveling or resident or otherwise in a country that has a consulate from one of your countries of citizenship, and those people from that country of citizenship don't often go to that third country. Oftentimes you have access to kind of the highest levels of diplomatic channels, right? And I'll tell a quick story here. I don't think I've mentioned this one before, but I was in Venezuela years ago. And I had a situation where I contacted the Iranian consulate, basically. I was alarmed and annoyed by the way that I was treated. One of the only times that I was kind of like openly discriminated against, and kind of like a way that was so shocking. I actually thought it was a joke at first. And I called the consulate, and within 50, I didn't even ask for the consul general, but within 15 minutes, I was forwarded along to the consul general. And the first thing he said to me is, oh my gosh, what are you doing in the country? He just was not used to any Iranians being in Venezuela contacting him, basically, or having contact with the consulate. And so, it was, it wasn't a big deal that day. It wasn't an important issue that I had to deal with. But if I had a really important issue to deal with, right, by being also Iranian, I was able to have access basically to a diplomatic channel, right? Not that they were rolling out the red carpet, but a diplomatic channel, and let's call it a level of diplomat that I probably would not have access to in a country that a lot of Iranians travel to, right? So that's an interesting benefit. In that case, it didn't end up being an important use case for me, but it certainly could have been, right? And in other instances, it certainly is, right? That's achieved, of course, by nationality toggling. So military conscription, consular assistance, constriction of third country visa issuance, closing of third country consulates, travel bans, heightened security standards, and then legislation from one country targeting citizens of the enemy country. So, for example, the US, internment of Japanese. These are what I consider, some of the top patterns, the top considerations, to be aware of, not just when you're considering getting another citizen, but if you are multiple citizen, if you're a citizen of multiple countries, one of the countries goes to war, right, or is affected by war, if you have a checklist, right, if you're kind of a prepper, a mobility prepper, maybe these are the things that you run down and start thinking, considering about how these could affect you, potential attack vectors that these could present. So what does everybody think? Anybody want to take it in one direction or have questions? Or does anybody have any stories of nationality toggling? You don't have to talk specifics if you don't want to. You don't have to mention the exact countries. But does anybody have a situation where you were abroad and you could present yourself as, citizen of one of two or more countries, and you chose one for more advantageous terms and treatment?
So one of my friends, he's a Brazilian citizen and an Italian citizen, and he vacations every so often to go see his relatives here in the U.S. And he, of course, comes to the U.S. as an Italian because a Brazilian citizen would have to get a visa to come here and vacation. But as an Italian, you don't have to do any of that. You just have to sign up for the ESTA and comply with the terms of the ESTA.
Yeah, that's a great point. So for ESTA, okay, ESTA is basically the visa-free access to the United States. You still have to actually sign up for an electronic form, right, in order to visit the United States visa-free. There's, I believe it's 42 countries, maybe it's 42 or 43 countries of which their citizens have ESTA access to the United States, okay? So perfect example, what Jay's talking about, Italy, citizens of Italy have visa-free access to the United States through the ESTA program. Brazilians do not, Brazilians do not. So the guy's a multiple citizen, okay? He could do either one, okay? He could apply as an Italian citizen through ESTA and come visa-free, but he can also apply actually for a visa under his Brazilian citizenship, and he may want to in some cases, right? ESTA only allows you to stay visa-free for up to 90 days, whereas a typical B2 visa, if it's granted, allows you up to 6 months, and you can renew the B2 status when you're in the United States. So if he's here, he comes, coming to the end of his 6 months, and then he decides, oh no, I want to have a long vacation. I want to have a sabbatical. Let's say he's a professor. They give 1-year sabbaticals. He can apply to renew that status for another 6 months in the United States, right? So in that case, so toggling, obviously it can be a benefit either way. I mean, that in Jay's example, the friend just went with ESTA because presumably he wanted a short trip, right? Less hassle, less bureaucratic friction. He went through the Italian citizenship. But if he wanted to, have access, for a longer period of time, he could have applied under the Brazilian. He could also apply for the B2 tourist visa under the Italian citizenship. It's not just exclusively to the Brazilian. But that's a great example of nationality toggling to get to the United States. Here's a more recent example, okay, which is even more hard hitting. Trump came out with a travel ban, okay, just very similar to his travel ban in his first term, okay, restricting visa issuance and entrance to the United States to citizens of certain countries. Iran is one of those countries. So if you're an Iranian citizen, okay, per the terms of the travel ban, you cannot be issued a visa or enter the United States if you don't already have a visa, okay, unless you fall into one of the exceptions, okay. What's an exception? It's written in the proclamation. If you are a dual citizen, okay, and one of your citizenships is not subject to the ban, okay, that's an exception, okay. So a hypothetical, perfect example. There's a lot of French Iranians, okay, dual Iranian French citizens, okay. If that person applies to travel to the United States, okay, under their French citizenship, okay, they're not subject to the travel ban restricting Iranians. Okay, dual citizenship for the win, nationality toggling for the win. Okay, so that's a perfect example. And in fact, little inside baseball for U.S. immigration lawyers that are serving Iranians, Yemenis, and other people that are citizens targeted by the travel ban. Right now, this is that dual citizenship exception is what a lot of, I don't want to say a lot, but some practitioners are exploring in order to get their clients another citizenship, especially if they're well-heeled, to get them another citizenship by investment so that they can sidestep that travel ban, fall into the exception, and proceed to a U.S. visa using the other citizenship.
Yeah, just going to quickly jump in here. I thought I saw a headline that said that the U.S. is considering travel bans for some CBI countries. I'm not sure if that's going into effect or if that's just a proposed policy change.
Yeah, so there's consideration. There's a Department of State memo that lists an additional number of countries. I think it's a few dozen. It's, I think, either 24 or 36. And yes, included in that list is a number of CBI countries as well, right? So that's a potential attack vector to that mobility benefit, right, of that CBI. And Patrick, you and I have spoken about this. Patience, you and I have spoken about this. This is one of the fragilities of citizenship by investment. Okay, the CBI citizenship itself, as well as the granular benefits of those citizenships by investment, are more fragile. We're seeing that they're more fragile. Why? Because they're being targeted by third countries for stripping of visa-free access, if not actually outright bans, as is being contemplated by the Trump admin right now. Now, here's the thing. It's important to distinguish. Does that mean that if you are a citizen of two other countries and then you pick up a third citizenship by investment, that the third citizenship by investment is going to restrict you from having access to other countries that you would normally have, by those first two citizenships? No, it's not. Okay, at least not yet. That's not what we're seeing, and I don't think that's going to be the case. It's just that getting that the mobility benefit of that third citizenship is subject to, let's call it, more rapid degradation, okay, more fragility, okay, by the fact that it's that you obtain the citizenship by investment. So this is an unpleasant thing. It's been brewing. I mean, this dynamic has been brewing for a few years. I think for most stakeholders in the industry, it's been kind of obvious, at least for the stakeholders that don't bury their head in the sand or are highly incentivized not to talk about these things, right? And, I mean, if we're speaking frankly, a lot of CBI agents are, some are great, some are good, some are not good. But the reality is, obviously, the incentive exists to not discuss, those attack vectors to CBI. But yeah, going back to what you said, Patrick, that's a possibility. I don't think it's going to come to pass imminently. Okay, that CBIs are, citizenship by investment are included, or CBI countries, excuse me, are included in an expanded travel ban. I don't think that's going to happen, at least for the next 6 months. But obviously, that's just my speculation. We'll just have to see.
Yeah, I'd be curious to peel that onion back, because it seems like some of the programs where you might invest into real estate, even though it is, transactionally similar to a CBI, might be a little bit more robust than just, writing a check to the country. Um, to my knowledge, I don't think Turkey has been on a travel ban list yet. Uh, you know, St. Kitts and Nevis might be, and so the rationale behind that, I think, is probably a little flawed, uh, but at the same time, it shows you that it's probably the structure of that program in Turkey that differentiates it compared to a little more traditional CBI setups. Uh, I was going to lean on an example a little bit. Um, I have not had direct experience doing the toggling of um, citizenships, because my citizenship portfolio was not one that I was born with. It was one that I I, I earned through a lot of hard work and self teaching. But when I did live abroad in Latin America for a while as an American, and I will say that um, not the consular access was okay, but the biggest lift I actually got was being an American abroad in a Latin American country. I mean, in this case, it's Panama. I have a lot of connections in Panama. If anyone ever needs, some mobility solutions for the country, um, but uh, but I was able to network and make a great, fantastic use of my time networking with people who were staff from other third-party consulates. And so, you were speaking about being in Venezuela with the Iranian embassy or the Iranian consulate. Um, you know, the smaller the country, the easier it is to, get someone on the phone, so to speak. And Panama is, it's 6 million people. Half of those people live in the major city, and only so much of society is really geared towards that level of export facing industry. And so your ability to you know meet with the ambassador from some other country to Panama is pretty high. I met three of them, and I wasn't there for that long. So I think if you're in a situation where you need to connect with people, I think being that differentiated third citizenship is a huge potential add. I know that's a little outside of the scope because this is not related to conflict, but I there's something to be said for being in a country that is a little bit smaller, but if a country is wealthy enough to have a consulate in that country, then that's definitely an added advantage. I also have examples of the reverse, but I'll save those for later.
Yeah, it's a great example. The smaller a country is, the fewer the levels between you and the top political leadership. That's just a fact. And I think because in the United States, we have such a huge political. First of all, we're a hugely populous country. I believe number 4 in the world, 330 million. We have such a huge political apparatus. I think most Americans kind of take it for granted that the idea of reaching, an ambassador or a cabinet member, it's just not realistic unless you have something super duper compelling or something. Even then you might not be able to. You might get the person's assistant or the deputy or something like that. But this is not the case with smaller countries. A few years ago, I was in discussions. I was in discussions with a small European country to possibly become an honorary consul in the United States. And as part of that, I had a 45-minute Zoom meeting with the ambassador. He himself, just me and him, nobody else, not even an assistant. Um, and that, I mean, if that was not a small country, would that have happened? Less likely, much less likely, right? That's kind of something that happens, more so with smaller countries. There's just fewer people, and that means there's fewer degrees of separation between you and whoever in that country. So, definitely a consideration. If you're a citizen of 2 countries or maybe just 3, right? Maybe the size of the country is not important enough of a consideration for you. But if you're long-term portfolio building, if this is something that you're interested in, you're thinking about, a fourth, a fifth, a sixth. Okay, well then maybe the size of the country and potential access to the political apparatus, maybe that becomes more of a consideration for you. Here's another kind of funny story that I just remembered related to nationality toggling. Okay, I don't know if this is actually toggling because I didn't really toggle. I just kind of gave up two. I gave up 2 citizenships, the knowledge of them, and I had a little funny interaction. Years ago, I think it was 10 years. It must have been at least 10 years ago because Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was president of Iran. I was in a taxi in the Netherlands. And the guy started, this is even before Uber, the taxi driver started talking to me, and he said, where are you from? And I said, I came from the United States. He said, what's your name? I said, Parviz. He said, is that Iranian? I said, yeah. And he said, are you an Iranian citizen? I said, yeah. And I have no problem saying this here because I'm upfront about these 2 citizenships. And I said, yeah, I'm an American Iranian citizen. Okay. And then there was a pause, and he said, I love your president. And I said, oh, thank you. And then there was another pause. And then he said, not the American one. At the time, George W. Bush was president. I wasn't happy with either president at the time, but that just cracked me up. I couldn't help myself. I burst out laughing.
That's pretty funny. I'll share a brief story, just because we're sharing stories here a little bit. But when I was at graduate school, I spent graduate school in Washington, D.C. So between multiple projects and a couple little side consulting gigs, I did spend some time at a couple embassies um, in Washington, D.C. And if you're not familiar, not always, but some embassies are attached to their consulates and some are separate. And generally, larger countries have separate facilities. Um, Mexico has separate facilities, um, but some are combined. Italy has combined facilities. Canada has combined facilities. And I was doing a project that was like a faux proposal for a international development project for water infrastructure, really nerdy stuff. And it was for Kyrgyzstan. It was in the Kyrgyz Republic. Was this project that was long stalled, and they were like, "How do we figure out funding?" And part of that project involved my ability to go to the embassy of Kyrgyzstan in Washington D.C. And for those who don't know, Kyrgyzstan a former Soviet country, part of the former Soviet Empire, very mountainous, historically underdeveloped, and uh, I was able on like a Wednesday in the afternoon, I was able to spend an hour with the ambassador from Kyrgyzstan to the United States, um, and he spoke about how historically Kyrgyzstan didn't allow dual citizenship because they were a Soviet country, and that was pretty standard at the time. And as a result, the guy said when he first came to the United States, it was such a fortunate for him that his son, because this guy was, significantly older, his son had the opportunity to work, and his son worked at a McDonald's. It was like a really big deal. And you know, I asked him about that experience, and he said, well, the thing to consider is that Kyrgyzstan doesn't have that many embassies because it's not worthwhile to have 200 embassies or 190 embassies. Um, they had only for most, post 90s all the way until now, they only have for most of that time period, they only had a handful of consulates. And so or a handful of embassies. So if they had the opportunity to serve in an embassy, it wasn't one out of 200, it was one out of significantly less. And they were generally only in countries that were ones where it was worth having, a diplomatic relationship and a permanent staff there. So, there probably at the time was not an embassy in Mexico or Canada. The embassy in the United States functioned for all three. And it goes back to consular and embassy. I'm using those interchangeably, but consular access during times of crisis, sometimes there might not be a consulate, particularly for a country that doesn't have the resources for this globe spanning foreign service. And my experience with that, uh, my my project with the Kyrgyz Republic embassy was reflective of that. And it was one that you know it on paper, but when you hear about how it impacts someone's life story when it's their only opportunity and they are among the most educated in their society, it really kind of shines a light as to how valuable that opportunity and access really can be.
Yeah, one other thing, Patrick. A lot of countries, and I haven't done a formal study of this, but I find it again kind of to be more typical of smaller countries. A lot of countries will use their diplomatic network. They even expect their diplomatic network to actually present business opportunities and to expand the business interests, both of their own citizens abroad, as well as foreign businesses and businessmen who want to do business in their country. And that's, I mean, that's something that is oftentimes, that's oftentimes some of the responsibilities of some of these consulates and embassies, actually, economic liaisons. Um, I have found that this, to what extent consulates are interested in this varies wildly, right? Some consulates, it's just a in some countries, it's a total non-consideration, and in some countries it's really serious, like the diplomats and then the greater, of course, honorary consul network sometimes has a real mandate actually to try to bring in business or to make connections, but between business people, business opportunities, especially related to industries that are high regulation or high visibility. Okay, so creating manufacturing. Okay, for example, manufacturing plants, factories, import export. What's another one that comes to my mind? I'm drawing a blank here, but there's a few others that I was thinking about this. And so yeah, that, I mean, probably not among the most important considerations for where to get citizenship or try to focus for your portfolio, but it's there, and in some countries it's taken seriously. All right, so here's a question, open question. Actually, I'll ask you, Patrick, first, and then anybody else who wants to chime in. Okay. Does the potential downside, let's call it the potential war downside of picking up another nationality, okay, so prospect of future military conscription or anything else related, that's a potential downside, does it possibly increase to you the more citizenships you have? Okay, and what I mean by this is if you're let's say you have two citizenships, you're considering a third, and that has a red flag of mandatory military conscription, okay, and or it's in a volatile part of the world. Does your analysis of that factor change if you have two citizenships going to three versus, let's say, you have four and you're considering picking up a fifth one? Okay, and are you less incentivized to pick up that potential downside when you already have four citizenships going to the fifth versus if you have two and you're considering the third? What do you think, Patrick? Or are they the same?
That's a great question. I'm going to answer that in two pieces. The first would be it's just a simple risk reward calculation. What are the additional benefits of that citizenship? And what are those potential costs, including conscription risk? Let's call it conscription risk, because whether it's mandatory or comes in the time of conflict. I mean, I'm biased in the sense that I would probably think that the benefits um, outweigh conscription. There's very few situations where conscription has a really high probability, right? It's never a 25% probability. It's usually like a 2% probability, but when that 2% probability hits, it's pretty drastic, right? So um, I think you're more inclined to accept that risk when you're going from two to three than when you're going from, say, four to five. Um, and then the second piece I would answer with is, it all comes down to effective reach of the country as well. And I'm not saying one should not, and I'm not saying one should not follow orders, so to speak. But I think the Ukraine example today is just such a fantastic case study. You know, people from Ukraine, if they're following the letter of the law, they'll only have one citizenship. Um, but then war breaks out, and you don't want to be conscripted, and so you leave the country. You go down to Playa del Carmen, and you see a lot of Ukrainians. You go down to, certain cafes and neighborhoods in Buenos Aires, and it's, there's a lot of Russians and Ukrainians, avoiding conscription. Um, but then they run into issues because you do the back of the napkin math. Ukraine issues 5-year passports. The conflict has been going for 3 years, a little over 3 years now. Based on a weighted average, a majority of people will now have an expired passport, and they can't get that reissued at a consular location. They have to go back. At least the men have to go back to the Ukraine to get that document reissued. And if you have a residency abroad, it's attached to that passport, that travel document. So the question then is, if you introduce a second or a third citizenship into that scenario, it allows you to still operate around the world on a different travel document, a different citizenship, without having to comply with a conscription order. Is that breaking the law? Definitionally, yes. But if that's something you're willing to do in lieu of, getting sent to the front line, so to speak, um, then it all comes down to what level of enforcement there is for that conscription. Is it a country that has that reach to be able to find you abroad? Are they willing to extradite people so that they can serve in a conscription scenario? You know, the answer for Ukraine a year ago was no. Is that going to be the case a year from now? I don't know. And I think that that's something to consider. Like, is this, is the conscription that you see, is it one where, if you're in the United States and there's a draft and you're 58 years old, chances are you're going to be serving, but you're going to be a desk jockey. But if you're in Israel, you're probably going to be boots on the ground. If you're in Ukraine or you're in Russia, you're getting sent to the front lines with drone warfare and a meat grinder. Like, they're all different scenarios of what that conscription can look like. And so I think doing some of that analysis between the tactical of what that obligation is and the reach of that country is a good way to say, you know, is this a 1 out of 10 or is this a 10 out of 10 in terms of that conscription obligation on a third or fourth or fifth, citizenship?
Yeah, I agree. I agree. Obviously, the risk presented by that particular citizenship obviously has to be, considered in consideration, in conjunction with what other mobility assets, let's call it, that you have at your disposal. I like the term conscription risk. I'm going to go with that. So conscription risk. I think, Patrick, that I think I think on average, a person is less incentivized to pick up the conscription risk going from citizenship, 4 to 5 versus 2 to 3. Okay. And here's the way I look at it. I consider the benefits, generally, if we consider the benefits of a citizenship, I consider them to basically have diminishing returns. Okay, the more you add. Okay, after you get to 2, 1 to 2 is the big leap. Okay, I call that the genesis of option at the nation state level, a robust option. 2 to 3, you have more benefits, but not as much of a jump as from 1 to 2, right? And then 3 to 4, you have more, but still they're diminishing. The returns are diminishing the more citizenships you add. But I'm not certain that the downside risk, the downside conscription risk, okay, is diminishing the more citizenships you pick up, right? I'm not sure that the nature of that, the accrual of that downside risk is symmetrical, okay, with the upside, return that you get by adding additional citizenships. Hypothetically, if you were to pick up, let's say you had 4 citizenships in 4 countries that don't have mandatory conscription, okay, and you were to pick up another 4, okay, that all have mandatory conscription, okay, your returns, your benefits going from citizenship 4 to 5, 5 to 6, 6 to 7, and 7 to 8, right? And this is an extreme example, right? But this is obviously how we want to consider. We want to, consider limits. Your accruing benefits are greatly diminishing, right? Going from 4 to 5, and then 5 to 6, 6 to 7, 7 to 8, okay? But on the downside, okay, when you've picked up, citizenship 5, that's one mandatory, that's one conscription risk, let's call it. And obviously not all conscription risks are equal, obviously, but let's call that 1. And then you pick up a 2nd and a 3rd and a 4th, okay? You've picked up, right, 4 real serious conscription risks, okay, potential downsides, in exchange for what I would consider very limited, diminished, upside, going from citizenship number 4 all the way to 8. Okay, so as a result, I mean, this is the way I think. I'd love to hear from anybody else, or if anybody sees it differently or thinks that I'm not looking at this the right way. But the way I look at it is that generally speaking, assuming all is equal, and not all conscription risks are equal, but considering they're all equal, right? I think the risk is more palatable going from 1 citizenship to 2 or 2 to 3, okay, because of the much greater return on citizenship benefits that you get as a result of picking up that potential downside. The other thing, Patrick, you referred to, right, the idea of like the 2%, like the low probability event that has a devastating impact. This is what I call playing Russian roulette with the 50-chamber cylinder. Okay, 50 chambers, Russian roulette, right? You throw 1 bullet in, okay, 1 in 50 chance that you pull on that. So only 2% chance you pull on that. But if you do, it's game over. Okay, basically you're dead, right? So that's just the little phrase that I use basically to discuss a risk that has a very low possibility of being realized, but a devastating impact if it is realized. But yeah, I look at conscription risk as generally less palatable the more citizenships you have. All right, anybody have any thoughts here? Jay, Andrew?
Hey guys, Patience here. I think the idea of conscription risk is a really interesting one when you try to quantify that risk. For example, there are countries that have taken a twist with the way their armies operate, especially the fact that some of them are becoming fairly professional. So the amount of people decreases, but the professionalism of the military increases tremendously. An example of that, there are many of these. The British did that, the French did that, meaning that they have less the need of actual conscription because they also have less the risk of a high intensity war the way the Russian did with Ukraine. Right? So I jokingly said yesterday on X, I jokingly said nuke or no nuke. It's a little bit more complicated than that. After all, the Russian did invade Ukraine, so you have that risk, right? But the Russian army wasn't as specialized as other Western armies could be. So I'd say as an individual, I would have to look at this and say, okay, what is the risk that my country gets into a high intensity war that requires boots on the ground and that requires boots on the ground that are not specialized? Because you might need to send people, but people for whom it's their careers, right? Um, this has led to some doctrine, especially around nuclear nuclear powers in Europe for the past few decades. And for example, France has been scaling down. It used to be until something like 98 or 99 that we had like a 1 year or 2 years of mandatory military service that went away because the need didn't really came. And then a few months ago, the discussion started again. Should some of that, like should some of those civil service or military service be brought back? And if so, what form does it take? But the current state of the military is that it's not able um, to actually get that many human resources back into their ranks. So I'd say, as an individual, I have to look into that. If the country of citizenship that I'm looking at already has a form of fairly wide military force like Iran does or like Turkey does, or things like or other countries like South Korea, and the risk of a high intensity war is pretty palpable, then I would probably be careful. Um, on the other hand, if the military is more professionalized, then I would probably I'll probably be feel better. That would be my take on the situation.
Yeah, that's an important factor. Of course, I definitely agree. I mean, to the extent that we're able to predict or try to predict how a military is going to act, of course, the more, the older you are, and I guess the less the more useless you are, and the more professional the military, then, perhaps the lesser the conscription risk for you. Um, I would probably just say the vulnerability, I think, of that factor, or trying to consider that factor, is the volatility of war, okay, the unpredictability, right? Could be that, your country starts off, highly professional and with a strong volunteer base, and then 4 years later, and 800,000 people dead later, they're just grabbing anybody off the street. Iran-Iraq war started in 1980, right? I don't think it was predicted to be a super long-lasting bloody war. Lasted 8 years with over 1 million dead combined on both sides. So, year 86, 87, 88, your calculations about how likely your conscription was in 1980 may not hold much value at that point.
I want to jump back on something Patrick said earlier when he talked about that the example of the Ukrainian passport expiring, and if it's the only uh, travel document, you're in trouble. I think the learning here is really interesting. The If I were to rephrase that, and correct me if I'm wrong, Patrick, but you probably don't want to be a resident or be actively living in a country of which you also hold the citizenship.
Yeah, I would agree. I use that example only because I know that Ukrainian citizens, if they're following the law, can't have another citizenship because the country doesn't allow dual citizenship. And therefore, their travel document is their ability to exist in another country. Um, but I would agree that if you have multiple citizenships and one of those countries is at war, and you are facing conscription risk, it is probably best to be in a third country, just for reasons of access to you, or the ability to compel that conscription risk. I use the Ukraine example because um, I have a couple friends who are regular divers in Cozumel. They live there, and every time they go to Playa del Carmen, they mention how there is such a contingency of Russian and Ukrainian people who are looking to avoid conscription. Um, and it made me think to myself about what countries you could go to where if you only had one citizenship and it had an expiration that was not a 10-year expiration, but a 5-year expiration, where could you go where you knew that if that document expired, you would still be okay? And there's not a lot of countries like that. And I think that's kind of an untested water. Um, I think of the Dominican Republic, not also because it's a diving spot, but because overstaying your visa is um, a pretty low grade fine. But what if you overstay your visa, but you also don't have, but you're still there, and you have an expired travel document, and you don't have the ability to get another citizenship? What happens then? I think is a pretty untested water. So that's why I brought that example up.
The U.S. is a country where you can be permanent resident in the United States and not have to maintain a valid passport in a foreign country. But you're absolutely right. Not all countries are like that. Some countries condition your residence in that country on the ability to keep and maintain a valid U.S. passport. And in fact, in those countries, that rule is one of the first things that the U.S. Department of State and the U.S. DOJ target when they want somebody back in the United States. Okay, it's much more costly to go through extradition proceedings, and in fact, the U.S. DOJ has an internal memo that cautions their prosecutors to only pursue extradition when the cost is going to be worth the squeeze, basically, because of the cost that's involved. So their first, much easier line of attack is to cancel. If it's the person U.S. passport and they're in a country that conditions their residency or stay on the validity of the passport, the first line is to cancel the U.S. passport. Okay, cancel the U.S. passport, then contact their corollaries, right, in government in that foreign country and say, hey, this person's got a expired U.S. passport, deportation. Now you're on a flight back to the United States to face justice, American justice. Patience, I don't think I quite understood. Can you explain a little bit more about your statement? You said you shouldn't be citizen in the country you're resident in. I didn't quite follow why.
Well, it sounds to me that if I was residing in Ukraine in February 22, I wouldn't want to be a Ukrainian citizen. The risk of conscription applies to citizens, right? So it sounds to me that if I am to reside somewhere, if I want to be able to nullify that risk, I want to be able to reside in country A, and be a citizen of country B and C. This way, if either B or C goes to war, I still have a way to circumvent that conscription risk. Does that make sense? I'm still not blocking.
Yeah, I hear you on that. But I think, I mean, the way I look at it is that the faster way, easier way to avoid it is to just leave when you're on the eve of war, right? If you have the ability, if you're a multiple citizen, you have highest right of entry and residence in a foreign country, right? You leave. You can leave. Now, obviously, that has costs to it as well too. But I think those costs, maintaining the exitability and acting on that exitability, I generally think that's a lesser cost than to avoid being citizen in the country that you're resident of. Because the fact of the matter is, you do enjoy a lot of great benefits being citizen of countries above and beyond just resident there. So that would be, I guess, my pushback on your statement.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that's fair for sure. What about so earlier we discussed about this ability to enter a country with a different travel document, even if you are a citizen of said country. Um, and you asked about experience. I have that experience because, without giving names, I'm a citizen of a country that allows people to get in. It doesn't necessarily allow, but at least uh, doesn't really care. And the reason they don't really care is because they have a really large diaspora outside of the country, and that diaspora is responsible for a fairly high amount of remittances, and at least if we look at it as a percentage of GDP, which actually fuels the local economy. So the reasoning here is they want to remove all the barriers for this diaspora that already has a pretty good travel document, and not force them to go and renew lower quality travel documents in consulates, and have that be a blocker for raising tourism income or things like that. So this how could I rephrase that? How could I phrase that as a potential factor? I would say look into maybe the share of GDP that the diaspora is responsible for, and what are the implications for the travel documents and the citizenship quality.
I think being able to enter your country of citizenship with a travel document from another country is a serious benefit. I think that's a real benefit and a real consideration, right? Countries that are really strict on the master nationality rule, right? The rule that you have to enter our country as our citizen and we treat you only as our citizen. They're imposing it's a restriction. It's a bottleneck, right? I tweet about the United States, right? The United States by law requires U.S. citizens to leave the United States with a U.S. passport and a valid U.S. passport or a substitute and an approved substitute, and return bearing a valid U.S. passport. Now, that's what the letter of the law is. Can you actually, can you present yourself at a land border in Mexico and say, hey, I want to come over, I got no U.S. travel document, but here's my identity. Yeah, you can. Okay, you're gonna have a lot of friction, a lot of difficulty, but you might get in. But you're certainly not going to be able to fly in. Okay, those options are going to be available to you if you're basically, at the border, like a land border. So I think that's, what your country of citizenship allows, patients. I think it's a serious benefit, okay, especially because I focus so much on the ability to enter and exit. And if your country says you can only enter with our document, well, guess what? That means they have control over your ability to enter and exit that country, irrespective of whether you're a multiple citizen. I'm not sure. I mean, GDP, how much of the GDP, consists of remittance? I'd be willing to come on board with that factor as analysis if we can see if we can see that a number of countries have that rule and also have a huge percentage of their economy being remittances set abroad. But yeah, if that pattern's there, that would be interesting. That would be a factor.
I'm saying that simply because, and I have no more data than that. But in the case of that country, it has shaped a lot of their foreign policy, and things like ministries dedicated for diasporas, online services to renew documents or to to update documents or things like that. But one of the risks that I do see with this kind of benefits is in the age of things like electronic travel authorization, um, specifically the one that is coming in the EU. I have a friend of mine who's both American and French, and his French passport is expired. He always travel. He always go back to France on the American one. They always talk to him and say, "Hey, you need to stop doing that." They always get him in. I'm I'm not sure that will still be available as a benefit with electronic travel authorization, Do you think there's a risk that the travel restriction simply gets denied because they detect that you're also a citizen and so you can't apply? I think that's the case for ESTA today, isn't it? Or maybe not.
Yeah.
I know accidental Americans get into the US on ESTA as well.
So for your first question, yes, I think it's a risk downstream if there's sufficient, incentive. My attitude, patience, regarding collection of information is that if it's collected, it's eventually going to be used, okay, and eventually used against you. That's, call me kind of skeptical of government or whatever, but that's the way I look at it. So yes, I think that's a latent vulnerability. For that latent vulnerability to become operative, there's going to have to be a strong enough incentive, right? In my opinion, okay, for that to happen. The second question, ESTA, American citizens. I don't know. Do American citizens? So if somebody is kind of on the radar as an American citizen, meaning they're not just an accidental American, but they never actually registered as an American citizen, can they? I know they're not supposed to be allowed to travel on ESTA. Has it happened? I don't know. I've not come across somebody who's reported that.
Yeah, they can. They can. That has been some pretty prevalent feedback on accidental American Facebook groups that some of them just applied for ESTA and they ended up discovering that they were American after traveling to the US and ESTA. So it's a little bit interesting.
Did anybody?
I'm not
sorry.
sure.
Did anybody?
Yeah.
Who's already been registered as a U.S. Citizen, whether it be by consular report of birth abroad or by passport, did anybody subsequent after that travel to the U.S. on ESTA?
That I'm not sure. They might just have been born in the U.S., but and probably at an old enough date that some of the registration wasn't done properly. I don't know.
Got it. What were you going to say?
That's all for me.
Oh,
Thanks.
I thought you were going to say something else. Okay, got it. Okay, yeah. So,
I have a quick little
ahead.
anecdote. It's not ESTA, but for the United Kingdom, their electronic travel authorization, because it kind of precedes ESTA, at least in terms of implementation. I think it's a good case study to watch because if you are a UK citizen, you are not required to enter the UK on your British passport. However, they've instituted the ETA, the electronic travel authorization, and since they've unveiled it, the cost of it has already gone up. Hilarious, of course, from £10 to 16. Like pretty nominal, yes, but let's say you're a British and a Hungarian citizen, and you're going to the UK, or you're transiting through London Heathrow, you apply for that ETA on your Hungarian citizenship. My assumption is that when they go to issue you that ETA, they're going to know that you're a British citizen, and they're going to have questions as to why you're transiting through London Heathrow on a Hungarian passport and not a British passport. And so I do think that there's going to be a situation where these are clarified. And I do think that because it's easier on, immigration professionals, like border professionals, because it's easier, I think they're slowly, ultimately, over the long course of time, going to just default to saying, if you're a citizen of this country, you should enter and exit on that passport, as opposed to building a lot of work just to provide you, the citizen, more workarounds for a foreign country as opposed to their own internal system. So it's just a perspective, but I do think that's ultimately where the world's going.
Could be, and I'd be interested to know what countries that don't have controlled borders end up doing there, right? For example, countries that are in the Schengen zone, right? If you if you don't have to present any passport to come into the country, right? How are you? What's your operative nationality when you're in the country, right? Are you that country are you the citizen of that country, or are you citizen of whatever country's ID you had in your pocket? Okay, that wasn't even presented when you walked across. So yeah, I think that's definitely interesting. Also, Patrick, by the way, I'm not sure if you saw, but a few years ago, authorities in Britain started making annotations on British passports of dual citizens. And I think you saw it because you commented on my tweet. I call them mouthy passports. Okay, passports that give too much information away, and one of which, of course, is where else you're a citizen of. And yeah, UK, I believe I'd have to go back and check. Check my notes, but I think they started doing that like 5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah, I think I think the UK is like the perfect case study for all of this because, as a legacy of, 400 years of empire, there is not only do they have British passports and a pretty unique, complicated citizenship history, but they have all of these um, British overseas citizenships with their associated passports that they also have to acknowledge and essentially control. And most of the people in particularly the last 2 3 years, a lot of Britons have left for opportunities abroad, be it summer in the south of Spain or Sardinia or the UAE, to pump some crypto scheme. But you know there's going to be a policy response to all of that from a customs and border enforcement perspective, and particularly as immigration gets more and more politically radioactive, that's going to be something we're going to see in pretty front and center probably in the next 24 to 72 months is my guess.
In terms of a country that provides the greatest variety of unique, interesting citizenship, mobility, and immigration issues, I consider the UK probably ground zero. Okay, for all the reasons that you mentioned. They're also part of a travel union, the CTA. They also were previously part of a larger travel union, the European Union, and they exited. They also, as you mentioned, have 6 forms currently of British citizenships, and previously they've had even more. Okay, they also have a huge variety of colonies, right, throughout the world. And on top of that, the English common law system is the basis, right, for half. It's either half the country, half the world's legal systems are either entirely based on it or heavily, heavily influenced on the English common law system. So absolutely, as far as use case, and then of course, like you said, okay, like their older electronic travel authorization system, um, they are ground zero as far as presenting just a variety of different. Oh, another one. Sorry, another one. I almost forgot. Another one that I'm very much interested in. Travel document, passport without citizenship. Right. Some of the so-called "quote unquote" British citizenships in reality are actually not British citizenships. Right. They're only citizenships in name, but they offer a travel document. So yeah, the UK, is its own. It's on an island in terms of interesting and illustrative, um, let's call it paths of where the world can go as far as freedom of movement. All right, so David, we got David here, we got Jay here, Chris, if you want to speak, just send me an invite. I'll approve it right away. It's 12:39. We've been going for an hour 40. Any other thoughts or any other interesting topics that we should discuss here related to nationalities in wartime?
I'm going to bring up a very opportunistic perspective just because it's nice and spicy at the 90-minute mark here. Um, when a conflict gets really bad, Iran-Iraq war could be a modern example. Um, you usually have the more belligerents countries are involved. Usually there is a policy response from a citizenship perspective. Um, we often forget that as a product of World War II, we got a lot of citizenship policy out of it. I mean, people forget that the United States passed something called the War Brides Act in 1944, which is something no way in hell would they ever name legislation that nowadays. But um, it was a means to say, oh, for people who got married as service members, what's the citizenship status as it relates to quotas or whatnot in the United States? You had a lot of people displaced in the Iran-Iraq War. It's not uncommon to find someone who might be of both Iranian, or Persian, and Iraqi citizenship because of displaced peoples as a result of that conflict. That could also be true in other certain situations of conflict. And so, um, you know, as it relates to being opportunistic, is a little bit dark, a little bit macabre, but you know, understanding how people are moved between places either because of service and conscription or because of just internal or external migration or people avoiding conflict. um, there usually is a policy response, and sometimes it is an accommodation, and sometimes it is forced upon a country. And so, there's always those pieces to look out for. If you did not want to be drafted into the Vietnam War, you know, the destination for a lot of people was Canada because the concept of going to Mexico in the 70s was just not on people's radar. I would think today, if there was conscription, most people would go to Mexico and not go to Canada. But, you know, is there a policy response there? Does a country say, hey, we see someone in this situation as a refugee, or do we see them as someone who's just trying to avoid a conflict that we don't want to be part of, so we're going to kick them back? And so, you know, I think there's some back of the napkin political analysis that makes sense to do should there ever be conflict to see if you can, you know, have an option available to you.
Yeah, great point. I mean, the most crude example that comes to mind is a country taking over new territory and then claiming that the residents are citizens. Russia's already done this in parts of eastern Ukraine. I had a client last year, Ukrainian. His father was in a town that was taken over. I forget the name, but it was taken over by Russia, and basically everybody was required to turn in their Ukrainian passports and basically, to claim that they're Russian now, basically. And so that's one of the first things that comes to mind. Sometimes it's not, sometimes the citizenship is not imposed. It becomes available as an opportunity. Okay. We're going to offer citizenship, to everybody that's resident of this region or of this area. Okay. Or even between countries that are not necessarily not at war, but just jostling geopolitically, right? Slovakia and Hungary, right? 2011, Viktor Orban basically opened up Hungarian citizenship by descent to effectively all ethnic Hungarians if they can basically, prove that they speak the language. The problem for their neighbors, okay, is that their neighboring countries host hundreds of thousands of Hungarians, okay, and now by that, Slovakia being one of them, by that play, Orban made a play for the, on the sovereignty and part of those countries by basically saying, hey, you guys, all you guys that are in Slovakia, Romania, etc., you can be Hungarian citizens as well too. Okay, right? So absolutely right, Patrick. I mean, we don't wish it to be the case. We don't wish for for citizenship opportunities. But the reality is, citizenship opportunities, or even impositions, do result. They do flow from war and from the migratory patterns of people trying to escape war. Okay, you're talking about Iran, Iraq, right? Iran-Iraq war started just after the revolution, the Islamic Revolution in Iran. In fact, it was partially a response. Saddam Hussein perceiving that Iran was weak at the moment, right? Just coming off a revolution. Many Iranian students had come to visit and study in the United States under the Shah from 1974 all the way to the revolution. Okay. Initially, okay, for the vast majority of them, their plan was to go to the United States, pick up an education, petroleum engineering or whatever, and then go back to the United States. Well, once the revolution happened and then the Iran-Iraq war, the prospects of staying and looking for a way to actually, take up residence in the United States and eventually work their way towards citizenship, obviously, look totally different, right? After Iran is coming off of a bloody revolution and the Iran-Iraq war, and many of them did stay, okay, to the tune of hundreds of thousands. So yeah, there's no doubt, and I can't really point to a policy change, vis-a-vis Iranian students coming to the United States. Maybe it's out there. I actually haven't researched it, but your point is well taken, Patrick. Countries respond in legislation, in formal policy, and even in informal policy to wartime developments.
This is not strictly a nationality-related question, although I guess that's a No, actually, it may be a nationality-related question. But I wanted to ask about the durability of temporary or permanent residencies during wartime. And I suspect that it's probably totally dependent on the host country as well as the resident's nationality as well. I'm sure that's a factor in some cases. But historically, what has the durability of residencies been like during times of war?
Yeah, great question. Not as robust as citizenships, right? So, I mean, generally speaking, and you already preempted me by saying it depends on the country. Of course, it does, but generally speaking, if you're looking at the pyramid, the hierarchy of robustness of right of residency, you're looking at citizenship at the top. Permanent residence under that, temporary residencies under that. And then you get into basically, what I would say probably after that is like a tourist visa, okay. And then underneath that, I would say basically electronic travel authorization. I mean, depending on the country and depending on the war, people get stripped of their residencies or unable to renew. Hell, I mean, it's less likely, but even sometimes citizens, okay, get their residency rights, either greatly degraded or infringed upon, right? The big example that people point to is the internment of Japanese Americans, right, during World War II. So generally speaking, if you're talking about the robustness of the residency right, I presume you mean the robustness of the right to stay in the country. Generally speaking, yeah, permanent residence is weaker than citizenship. Temporary residence, weaker than permanent residence. Now, if you're talking, there's kind of this related field, right, which is not the same, okay, but sometimes it gets conflated, which is if you're talking about the right of a person, okay, to move freely, for example, to exit the country, okay, now we might be looking at a different situation. Okay, oftentimes during war, okay, you actually have more of an ability or a right, okay, to leave the country, the danger zone, okay, being less than a citizen, being either a permanent resident, temporary resident, or just a tourist. Okay, so that's a totally separate but intimately related consideration, right? Being able to leave as a non-citizen.
Are you saying that a non-citizen might have a greater ability to leave a country than a citizen of that country would?
Yes, of a country at war.
Can you elaborate?
Yeah, I mean, typically the types of obligations that fall upon people that are within a country during wartime most heavily fall on citizens. So going back to what we're talking about, like mandatory, mandatory military conscription, or a prohibition on exiting the country, okay, during that period of time. These are typically obligations that are much more associated with first citizens, and then on a secondary level, possibly permanent residents than, for example, tourists.
I see. That makes sense. Thank
Less benefit, less obligation, including obligation to stay and fight. It's the way I look at it in general terms.
Yeah, I'll also add to that just anecdotally, unfortunately, but still, I think worthwhile, and that is the type of temporary or permanent resident you are, I think has a direct impact also based on the conflict, right? If you are, if you are, the United States had foreign citizens register during World War II, and that what that registration looked like was very different for Italians and Germans and Japanese than it was, someone who was from France and who was in the United States as a French citizen. Um, but I would also argue, I mean, look today at temporary and permanent visa policies in the United States. You know, I don't know if we're taking new immigrants from Russia or Ukraine. I would think that those applications would face some level of scrutiny, or people who are here now potentially renewing it would also face scrutiny. Um, but we're not in a war with China, and I would say that the scrutiny for someone who's a Chinese citizen in the United States is drastically greater, and that conflict is more related to perceived espionage as opposed to a hot war. And so, if you are here on, say, like a student visa, you're probably going to face a lot more scrutiny than just permanent residency because there's a lot more of a leading indicator of who you are as a person if you're here on a 10-year permanent residency as opposed to being here for a year or two, you know, in as at a as a university student from a country that we perceive as one trying to push foreign influence. So I think there's also some political analysis there as well.
Yeah, Patrick. So since the outbreak of the Ukraine and Russian war, I've had a number of both Russian and Ukrainian clients in the United States, naturalization clients, legal permanent resident clients. The ability, the extent to which they're able to, let's call it, access U.S. residency and possibly ascend to citizenship depends greatly on whether they're already here or they're outside of the country. Okay, if they're already here, right? Let's say, for example, as a legal permanent resident and they're applying for naturalization. There's not that. I mean, as of now, there's still not any formal additional scrutiny necessarily that they undertake, right, when they're applying for naturalization at the N400 and then going to the interview. But applying for residency from outside of the United States is a different ballgame, okay? Because you have to apply at a consulate. Okay, it's called consular processing, and there's a legal doctrine in U.S. immigration law called consular non-reviewability. Okay, non-reviewability, and it's just as bad as it sounds on its face. It's basically this doctrine that decisions made at the consular level vis-a-vis immigration applications, including green card applications, are non-reviewable. Okay, now technically there are some small, very narrow exceptions, but the bottom line is you're way more susceptible and vulnerable to a vicitudinal denial, okay, at a consulate. So applying for a green card at the consulate, it's called consular processing, versus applying for a green card from within the United States, okay, which is called adjustment of status. Way, way different. Almost to the extent that we really should consider basically them like two different categories, okay? And this remains the same for Ukrainians, Russians, other, let's call it unpopular nationalities. So a huge, huge consideration, at least in US law, okay, is whether you're already here and trying to get some sort of, let's call it, benefit, okay, immigration or mobility benefit, versus if you're abroad, okay, as a citizen of one of these quote unquote unpopular countries and trying to get in. Okay. The other thing that we've seen that has touched, that's been touched upon by the Russian-Ukrainian war is the access of consulates. Okay, kind of what we were talking about at the beginning of this call, right? Some Russian consulates, some U.S. consulates in Russia stopped processing certain types of visas. That creates a bottleneck, okay, because those visa applicants have to be routed to a different U.S. consulate. When a different U.S. consulate gets that increase in workload, the backlog starts right away. Okay, it's like a clog in a drain. Okay, you ever have a clog in your drain? Once you have it, okay, and then you start pouring water in there, immediately you start seeing pooling. Okay, and the more water that pools there, the bigger the pool becomes. Okay, we've definitely seen that, and that is exactly one of the main benefits of what we were talking about before. Okay. The springboarding benefit of citizenship that is consular shopping or friendlier consulate springboarding. We've seen it with Russia. Okay, we've seen it with Iran over and over and over again. And as long as visas and residency applications are received, if not adjudicated, at consulates, and I don't think on the world stage we're headed away from the system anytime soon. As long as we have that system, people are going to be vulnerable to these bottlenecks provided by consular closures. And as long as they're vulnerable to these bottlenecks, it means it's going to be a valuable benefit, okay, to be able to springboard to a consulate in a different country. All right, sweet. So it's been a good combo, 12:54 right now where I'm at, okay, on the West Coast. We've been going for an hour, 54 minutes. Any last topic anybody wants to talk about? If not, I'm just going to take a minute to basically pitch the topics for our next space and get any feedback on what you guys want to talk about next.
Could a resident of Greenland, could that potentially be a path to U.S. nationality without citizenship?
I don't know. I don't know enough about Greenland. You mean, are you talking about Trump's kind of threats / joking / talking about taking it over? Are you?
Yeah, I just wonder if that might be a possibility, since I think that's what happened essentially in Puerto Rico before I think there was an act of Congress to make all Puerto Ricans U.S. citizens. I think that there was a period of time where all Puerto Ricans became U.S. nationals.
Yeah.
And maybe we're able to opt out of citizenship.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Puerto Ricans became U.S. nationals first, and then citizens. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I wouldn't say just with the United States. I mean, if you're a resident in an area that's taken over by another country, generally speaking, the chances of being offered or even imposed that, the citizenship of, let's call it, the conquering country, go way up. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I really, I was so kind of like shocked and like uh, amazed by his comments. I never even really looked into whether that's really a real proposal. I should know more about this, but I really don't know if that's even something that's possible. That's really being considered. But if it is, yeah, I would consider that it's possible that Greenland residents become U.S. nationals, if not citizens.
I just thought that would be kind of a funny backdoor to it. But yeah,
So
thanks.
I do know that if you're an American national and you marry an American citizen, your kid, no matter what, your children, no matter what, are American citizens. And if you are an American citizen, you cannot become an American national. So I say that because I've only researched this one
Sovereign
late night.
citizens might disagree, Patrick. Go ahead.
Because you don't get taxed on your global income if you're an American national compared to an American citizen. And so, is there a way to get an American passport as an American national and not have to pay American citizenship-based taxes? And the answer is, if you're already an American citizen, the answer is essentially no, as far as I understand. But that's just purely based on desktop research.
No, that is the case. What you said is accurate, and in fact, unfortunately, there's always immigration and citizenship scams going around. There was a big one a few years ago. I want to say 3 years ago. Basically, follows kind of the protocol of a lot of scammers and these types, which is basically to misquote, miscontextualize some text, and then basically claim that a right arises as a result. So there were some videos on YouTube, there's one or two presentation by a guy claiming to basically take people from citizenship to nationality. I'm calling it a scam. I looked into the the issue, the research. I've never spoken to somebody who can claim that they went successfully from being a U.S. citizen to just a U.S. national and was recognized by the IRS. I don't understand. I don't see how the path is possible looking at primary source legal documents. I could be wrong, right? I'm not infallible, but I don't think it's possible. I think it's a scam, basically, people who are claiming to do that. So yeah, I mean, to David's point, I mean, could somebody, could a Greenland resident get into the sweet spot, if the U.S. ever takes over Greenland and makes him a national before they become a citizen? Yeah, I think it's possible. I think it's certainly possible. Okay, cool. So 1259. This has been the 10th mobility space. We're definitely continuing on. It's Mondays and Thursdays. It's usually 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, but I will have to, as this series progresses, change the times. When I have some sort of like conflict. I thought today we were going to talk about the detained man switch. That's what I wanted to talk about. This topic came up. It was a little bit more timely, and also people voted for this over the detained man switch. I want to talk about the detained man switch very soon. But here's the thing. Another really interesting situation came up, which is Pablo Manriquez of Immigrant Insider. They published a report basically from 2 days ago. It's an article, Major Airlines Sold Passenger Data to Border Agency in Secret Deal. I want to talk about this. So I've invited Pablo to basically co-host or to be a speaker on the next mobility space that I do. I'm waiting for him to hear back. If he can do this on Monday, and we can arrange a time, hopefully it's 11 a.m., that's going to be the topic for Monday. That'll be our 11th space. Okay, basically the findings of his investigation of Migrant Insider. If he can't do it, okay, then that opens up the possibilities for other topics, okay, for the mobility space. My leader would be to talk about the detained man switch, cousin of the dead man switch from 80s and 90s, thrillers and crime movies. But I'm open to other suggestions. If somebody thinks there's another, compelling topic that, especially if it's a timely one, that we should talk about for Monday if we can't get Pablo on from Migrant Insider. What do you guys think?
I think the detained man switch is is still topical. May not be as topical as the data from U.S. air carriers, but I think both of those are pretty topical. So if we slot them for the next week, I think it's a good position to be in.
One vote for detained man switch. David, Jay, any preference?
I mean, I think that's
No
the topic.
preference.
Sorry, David,
Yeah,
you
no-
go first, please, and then Jay. Say it again, David. I couldn't hear you.
I said I have no preference.
Jay, did you have something to add?
I said I thought that's an interesting topic.
Okay, done. So I'm not going to put up a poll vote. Okay, it's going to be if Pablo gets back to me and we can do major airlines selling our data to CBP, which is outrageous, by the way. Get outraged. If he can do it, we're gonna do that topic. If not, it's gonna be detained man switch. I'm gonna hopefully try to get an answer from Pablo by the end of today, and then I'm going to make the announcement. So that's it. Thanks for joining. This has been the 10th Mobility Space. We're doing 50 this year. It's Mondays and Thursdays. I have a master list of upcoming topics. We're going to be talking about both timely topics as well as kind of deeper topics, right? That are don't have to necessarily be related to the news. So the rules are everybody's welcome. Anybody can speak. Okay. So hope you guys and gals join us. And thank you to everybody who listened anonymously as well. Have a great one, everybody.